Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Claudia Bell and Lindsay Neill's vernacular food tradition and national identity in New Zealand. This is an interesting article. It's basically a report or the theoretical underpinnings that is describing a book that the authors, along with one other person, had recently published on the New Zealand meat pie cart or the pie cart. So, as such, the book itself is basically a collection of anecdotes and an oral history and a photographic history, from what they describe in the article, on the pie cart, which is a part of the New Zealand foodway system and part of the New Zealand foodways cultural landscape. This article is in many ways explaining the value of oral history, themes that emerge that they noted, so probably not suitable for a popular book, but well suited for academic discourse. And on top of that, they are explaining basically the value of oral history and the value of folklore to this is the food culture and society, so they are clearly it's an audience that is supportive of the study of vernacular food systems, but not necessarily through a folkloric lens. So, but what is a pie cart? A pie cart is exactly as it might sound. It's basically, well, probably not a cart. It's more equivalent. The best Canadian example I can think of in terms of equivalency is the chip wagon. The humble Canadian chip wagon, which is typically born from some kind of in its original manifestation, some reconfigured delivery van that has been adapted for having deep fryers and some kind of power source in order to generate them, or a gas source in order to fuel them. That and as a precursor to food trucks, I'll just park somewhere and sell the humble French fry. When I was growing up in Ottawa, chip wagons were just part of the cultural landscape, and they would be there in the downtown business district, where government office workers particularly, that would be a frequent lunch. I went to high school right in the downtown as well, and there was one that was parked a block and a half from school, and if you didn't like that one, there was another one that was parked about 4 or 5 blocks away. Easily adaptable to a lunch. And then they were also available for after school, weekends, and evenings, and into the night. So the chip wagon was just this ubiquitous place for food. And the pie cart is basically the same thing, except for the meat pie. They emerged sometime in the 1930s and 1940s, and they were sort of, they hit the right note. For one thing, up until that point, New Zealand didn't really have much of a self-identifying food culture cuisine. It understood itself as fundamentally still English, still basically an outpost of empire. The presence of Maori was really outside of the general public discourse, and it had. If it had any waves of immigration from outside of the English influence, it was they weren't necessarily part of the integrated conversation of a sense of place. So the food of the pie cart was incredibly basic. It was the meat pie. What differentiated it from one of the things about New Zealand context, and one of the things that New Zealanders had prided themselves on, was the abundance of meat in contrast to England, in contrast to the equivalent availability of meat for the working and even the middle classes in England. This was a country that was largely, or one of its economic bases was agriculture and animal husbandry. And so meat was part of the constituent diet, still in its humble forms. And even though we might associate New Zealand with lamb, with sheep, that was an export food. And so beef was the food of the masses, still in large quantities. And meat would be present at every single meal. Meat then therefore became associated with this rugged New Zealand attitude, precisely this lack of pretension, still influenced by Englishness, but of humble, earthy, a food that is the consequence of and the product of one's own labor. So it tied into this idea of New Zealand masculinity. It's simple, and again, it's a meat pie. It's portable. You can literally put it in your pocket, and you can look at other things like the presence of the meat of the Cornish pasty, for example, other forms of meat pies that had emerged in a working class context in England, and that one of the things about the meat pie was that you could slip it into your pocket. So it is something that you could bring with you at a lunch. The other aspect is that this is a form of fast food. This is a street food. This is a food that you would have either during the days, or on the way home from work, or on the way home from nightlife. Nightlife that wasn't really available when they first emerged because there were so many draconian drinking rules that the pubs closed at 6. You had to have restaurants. You might be able to have restaurants at the hotel, but they were expensive, and this became a concession to some kind of food availability outside of elite institutions, but still within the urban and industrial context. Now, pie carts weren't exclusive to the urban centers. They did have them in small towns, where small towns they might be the only thing, because they are not part. I mean, one of the things when we want to talk about vernacular food systems is that they are vernacular. They are not systematized. Someone might see the prospect, might see the presence of a pie cart and decide on their own ingenuity to start their own in a place where they recognize, it's a very basic capitalist system where they recognize that they can meet some particular need. Part of the aesthetic of the food cart is precisely this can-do attitude, this make-do attitude, this make-it-yourself DIY aspect, where they have old, caravans and sort of campers and so on, and I can do something with that, and they fix it. And these are not necessarily aesthetically pleasing, polished things. They serve the purpose of doing what they do. You can drag them to a place and you can start making making meat pies out of them. So meat and beef becomes part of it. Fast food systems become a part of it. Industrial food systems become a part of it. We sometimes don't think of these things as industrial foods, but first of all, they require things like the portability of the caravan, the automobile. So they are 20th century. By definition, they are 20th century. They're products of industrialization. They typically take place within capitalist systems. They are more or less, and again, New Zealand has a different context from Canada, a different context from England, a different context from the United States, but more or less they are coincident with a working population that works often outside of the home and outside of the landscape, works for someone else, and then they become something that they can, a food that they can grab either for their family or just for themselves. Fish and chips. The history of fish and chips is very much like that. The history of almost all street food is food that can be eaten quickly, that is available, that is produced cheaply, therefore purchased cheaply, and what's more, it does have things like high fat content, high sugar content, high caffeine content when we're talking about beverages, so they can give you that bolt of energy. Our landscape is surrounded by more of the roadside stand than necessarily the wagons. We do have wagons here in Cape Breton, but things like various roadside stands are and they're still part of the landscape. They are still places where people will go regularly to eat, and they become iconographic, which is one of the things that this is going, this article is moving towards. So you had this food that was easily available, that fulfilled the aesthetics of what constituted proper food, at the very least, the idea of the abundance of meat. And they were tiny little independent businesses. Again, this isn't a systematic thing. People saw this need. Maybe they were imitating, but they saw someone else do it and they did it on their own. And there was a certain sort of hypermasculinity about it, that they were typically stocked by men. It looked, even though there's probably, in fact, there was a lot of work behind the scenes in terms of the preparation of the materials for food. What's more, when we move past the history of them, we want to think about the cultural history, the way that they are remembered. And I think that's where the article becomes quite joyous in many ways. Once you have a food that emerges within a particular context, when that particular context changes, and you have things like the greater internationalization of food options, you have the beginning of fast food chains, you have the establishment of fancier chains, you have the establishment of restaurants, you have the influx of non-Anglo immigrant communities who start their own restaurants that become the object of interest and the object of culinary exploration for the large Anglo population. And as the population doesn't necessarily consider itself as a monoglot Anglo, as it shouldn't have ever, but as the growing consciousness that New Zealand identity is not defined wholly and in sum by British ancestry, but is actually sort of a contemporary multicultural group, the pie cart seemingly could have been eliminated. It could have been a relic of the past, but now it becomes this object of a certain form of, I don't know if veneration is the right word, but fondness, that it becomes a playful remnant of the past. Like, remember when this was all we had. And the generation today might not actually remember when this is all we had, but that's because we're now entering into this realm of continuity, this train where the pie cart becomes first a concession and then a feature, and a feature of one's childhood, going out with one's parents to a meat cart, to a pie cart, going out with one's friends, going out with one's various social groups, and at times when it was sometimes expressly not in keeping with the perceived perception of what constituted an ideal New Zealander. It is about nightlife. It is about the rougher parts of town. It is about all these things that are a certain sense of vibrancy. So the fondness that people have for the pie cart is often associated with the fondness for the friendship group and the nighttime activities and the jouissance that was felt over the years of one's adolescence and early adulthood, that often culminated in a trip to a pie cart for something to eat just before heading home. And so that kind of fondness, a fondness, again, it's the food that you might not, until you have books like this, until you actually have food gatekeepers, and probably including things like New Zealand tourism, introducing the pie cart into the discourse of what constitutes this particular place. Yes. Until perhaps the 21st century, when it becomes enshrined cautiously, because they do talk about how simultaneously some of these classic carts have been systematically moved away from key tourist areas and literally shoved down the road because of their portability, and that they sort of move somewhere else and are on the edge about how one wishes one's city or how one wishes one's food system to be represented to a potential outsider. Like, how does this? And then it builds on that strange culinary tourism complex of, we wish to present ourselves the way we think that others wish us to present ourselves. Therefore, these things that are just too complicated to explain because they deal with vernacularity, because they don't fit into a naive understanding of New Zealand, they get shunted to the side. And perhaps they've yet to sort of incorporate into that kind of argument of place. So they have yet to take on, again, that sense, the public discourse, the state discourse might yet have taken on that, might have yet to take on that idea of fondness, to take this thing and locate it in such a way within that frame of how we wish to present ourselves. Like, come to New Zealand, eat at one of our famous pie carts, and then explain that system, because you're dealing with an intensely vernacular food where the locals have a sense of place, and the locals have a sense of fondness, and the locals have a sense of pride with it, despite the fact that it doesn't necessarily easily fit into their common discussion. So there is a question about what the future is of the pie cart, and the pie cart, of course, is not a constant. It used to, some of these pie carts don't even sell pies anymore, because it's less about the food and more about the cart itself. It's more about that sense of continuity with the past. Sort of fries and mushy peas from the 1930s quickly abated. The meat pie itself is often not necessarily part of it. It is more chips, and it has adapted to the food tastes, and even to a certain extent to the health tastes, although we don't often go to these kind of places for the idea of some kind of healthy cuisine. Nevertheless, and I'm sure this article doesn't mention it, but I'm sure the food truck phenomenon has entered into New Zealand as well, and so you have this kind of retro form that's emerged. I was looking for examples of chip wagons in Ottawa for the pictures that I'm going to be throwing around here. And it is odd that, to me, it is odd that I see these carts and they're the same, these wagons, and I see these same wagons that were there when I was a child 30 or 40 years ago. Oh, goodness, I just did the math. So, 30 years ago, this was the chip wagon that was by my school. And then, coincident are these very new, custom-made chip wagons that are clearly catering to, either catering to or have adapted to the times, either catering to a different clientele or have adapted to the times. And so the food truck becomes something else. We have, in Cape Breton, there are a number of chip wagons still. They are more seasonal. There's one or two that are permanently ensconced because they're associated with stores. But then we also have the beginnings of food trucks where they are selling wonderful, but they are not working class food concessions. Nor are they trying to be, and they shouldn't be disparaged for not being that, but they are sort of a different ilk. I imagine New Zealand is experiencing the same kind of phenomenon. So it's a brief article, and makes me want to, first of all, it makes me want to have one of these meat pies. And secondly, it makes me want to, I can't wait for the chip wagon season to open up again. In moderation, Friday night treats. It's a wonderful thing. There's the famous one in this city, Fuzzies, and it's literally a block and a half away. And it hasn't opened yet because it's March as I am filming this. Alas, but the time will come, summer will come, and then the city will open up again, and there'll be Fuzzies fries, and you can just walk down the street and you'll be hit by that smell of hot oil and potato and grease, and it's that sensory experience. I think they talk about it. They talk about it in their reminiscences, that it is a sensory experience. I remember going to the food carts again, both when I was during my day life as a student and during my nightlife as a budding adolescent, going to the food cart and the sounds that were around, the cityscape sounds, the argued conversation, which was because you always had to yell just because to make yourself heard. It was never hostile. It was just always brash. The smell of hot brown paper bag, slowly getting just a little bit grease stained, and then that the squeeze bottle of ketchup that had been sort of sitting out all day, and it was just that perfect room temperature ketchup, and just thinking of it. And then that massive shaker of salt, which always put too much salt, as if too much salt is a possibility. Oh my goodness, I'm literally salivating. I don't think that has happened in any of these videos. As ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best. We've been talking about Claudia Bell and Lindsay Neill's vernacular food tradition and national identity in New Zealand. Eat well, be well, and I will see you later. Bye-bye. So it's the, yeah, no, I don't need to talk about that either.